Okay, we're going live. Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending Learn. This is our first in a three-part series called the Hope Conference Series. I'm your moderator, Kim Slade, and I will be moderating all of the main stage events today. To start, Abuse Hurts would like to acknowledge the land on which our building is housed and where our employees, volunteers, and members of the public gather. This land is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe Waki, and the Wendake Neonwencio. We are guests on this land, and it is our shared responsibility to respect, honor, and sustain the land. We acknowledge this land out of respect for the Indigenous nations who have called Turtle Island, also called North America, from before the arrival of the settler peoples until this day. Most importantly, we remember the history of these lands has been tainted by poor treatment and lack of friendship with the First Nations who call them home. As we are all attending today from different regions, we encourage you to learn about the lands on which you reside to develop a deeper understanding of the Indigenous nations in your area. To do this, you can access a map in the announcements section of the conference site. We would also like to thank the funder of the Breaking Silence Building Communities Project, Women and Gender Equality Canada, who have made this conference series possible. For our sessions today are being recorded and will be available for viewing for all registrants following the close of the conference by visiting the conference link. Now I would like to introduce our first speaker of the day. Alan Campbell is the CEO and founder of Abuse Hurts, also known as the Canadian Centre for Abuse Awareness. Alan founded the charity in May of 1993 and has been successfully helping and advocating for survivors of abuse through education, awareness, and even specific programs she created to help survivors in practical and empowering ways. Among numerous awards, she is also the recipient of the Order of Ontario for her work in advocacy. Welcome, Ellen, and thank you for opening up today's conference.
Thank you, Kim, and good morning. On behalf of all the board of directors and the people we serve, I want to welcome you to the first installment of our Hope Conference series. We're so excited, and I know you're going to be so pleased with the speakers that we have today. I want to thank Tam Bowie for seeing the need to provide more information and support for intimate partner violence. You will meet Tam during the day as he does a workshop called 2 Million Reasons to Commit a Murder. He then reached out to Laura Norwood to submit a proposal to Women and Gender Equality Canada to receive a grant to produce this series of 3 conferences on our behalf. We then reached out to Kim Grant, who has done an amazing job along with Laura to make this happen. I also want to acknowledge Liz Pia, Jessica Williams, Helena Kamika, and Marcus, who have also contributed greatly to this initiative. And of course, I want to thank all our volunteers and a special thanks to Brad and his team of therapists that are there to assist you today. As a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, I founded the agency 30 years ago in the basement of my house this coming May. The trauma from my abuse caused me great pain and a lot of trouble in my life. And I ended up in the psych ward and was suicidal because the pain was just too great, as I'm sure some of you watching will understand. But I'm a woman of faith, and I started to fight back and regain my life. When I started the agency in the basement of my house, though I never expected it to grow to the size it is today. We provide support for individuals coming out of abusive situations through product donation, such as clothing, housewares, toiletries, furniture, anything they may need to get started again. And we also provide education and awareness, and we have our upcoming e-zine in July, and of course, conferences such as this. We have many other programs, and I encourage you to just check out our website at abusehurts.ca. I believe this conference will not only be informative, but a huge support to those who have gone through abuse and trauma. The COVID pandemic has compounded challenges around violence and in many cases increased its severity. The Canadian Observatory for Justice reported in 2018 that 118 women and girls were killed by violence in Canada. That is one death every 3 days, with the highest rates in Nunavut, Yukon, Manitoba, and Alberta. The Canadian Women's Foundation published a report in 2014 and found that 83% of all police reports for domestic assaults were against women. This pattern is consistent for every province and territory across Canada. The same report indicated that gender played a crucial role in the risk of intimate partner violence. Certain factors have been found to increase vulnerability, such as being an immigrant, being a visible minority, being Indigenous or LGBTQ2, and or having lower economic status. Challenges are compounded as marginalized communities are disproportionately more likely to be criminalized or ignored. Findings show how sometimes racism, discrimination, and stereotyping towards women and girls fit one or more of the vulnerability categories. We have many experts in the field speaking today to help us navigate these troubled waters. Through knowledge sharing, we can all become better equipped to understand and respond to intimate partner violence and less likely to re-victimize those we are entrusted to assist. Please feel free also to visit our virtual booth in the exhibit hall. While you're there, you'll meet our wonderful program coordinator, Kaylee Stresov. Have a great day, and I look forward to your feedback. And it's now my privilege to introduce our first speaker, Jackson Katz. Jackson Katz, PhD, has long been a major figure and thought leader in the growing global movement of men working to promote gender equality and prevent gender violence. He is co-founder of the multiracial Mixed Gender Mentors in Violence Prevention, MVP program, one of the longest running and most widely influential gender violence prevention programs in North America, and the first major program of its kind in the sports, culture, and the military. Dr. Katz is one of the early architects of the bystander approach to prevention. He is the creator of the award-winning Tough Guys video series and has appeared in numerous other popular documentaries, including Misrepresentation, The Mask You Live In, and Hip Hop, Beyond Beats and Rhymes. He is the author of the best-selling book, The Macho Paradox, Why Some Men Hurt Women and How All Men Can Help, and Man Enough. Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and the Politics of Presidential Masculinity. His TED Talks, Violence Against Women, It's a Men's Issue, has been viewed more than 5 million times. An acclaimed public speaker, Katz has delivered thousands of lectures and conducted trainings in all 50 states, 8 Canadian provinces, and on every continent except Antarctica. We welcome you this morning, Dr. Katz.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Ellen, and congratulations on your leadership and creating this incredible organization back in 1993. I think it's very, very impressive, to say the least. And you've stuck with it all these years, and I'm sure you and your colleagues have helped, just countless individuals, as well as being part of this incredibly important movement, both in Canada and North America more broadly, but also globally, really. So thank you for that. I also want to thank your staff and colleagues who helped me in organizing my participation in your great conference series, and I'm honored to be the opening keynote speaker. Let me just say, as a man, it's especially gratifying and an honor to be in this position, because let me be clear, women's leadership both again in North America, but also all over the world in a multiracial, multi-ethnic sense. Women's leadership over the past couple of generations, really, the past half century, but even beyond that, but specifically over the past half century, in creating the battered women's movements and the movements against sexual violence and sexual abuse and the sexual abuse of children and sexual harassment, all these issues that I'll refer to in shorthand as gender violence issues. Women's leadership has been utterly world-changing and transformative. I mean, it's still an unfinished project. I appreciate that, but the changes that have happened in our societies, the positive changes, whether it's services and the architecture of support for victims and survivors that many of us take for granted, although it's, again, an imperfect system, but that many of us take for granted in North America that other parts of the world don't even have. But that architecture of support for victims and survivors, the offender accountability to the extent that that the laws have changed to reflect a new sensibility about the unacceptability of domestic and sexual violence. And then to the extent that we have prevention programming embedded in schools or in institutional practices. And again, we have a long way to go to do it, what I think is, really effectively. But to the extent that that's happening, prevention. So those three pieces, survivor services and advocacy and treatment, offender accountability and prevention. In all those areas, women's leadership has been the critical piece. And will continue to be. And by the way, women and girls have benefited, but also men and boys. And by the way, people who are not men and boys or women and girls, in other words, across the gender and sexual identity spectrum, everybody has benefited. And I'm specifically say that boys and men have profoundly been affected in a positive way by women's advocacy and leadership in all of this. I'll just give you one example of that, because my whole talk this morning, I could talk about the benefits to men and boys of women's leadership in the gender violence field, if you will, the domestic and sexual violence field. But I'll just give you one example. In the field, as many people know, we've been focusing for decades now, it's not a new focus, on the effects of, say, for example, domestic violence on children, right? All the children growing up in homes where their father abuses their mother's boyfriend abuses their mother. Sometimes the mother is the abuser. This is also true in gay, male, and lesbian relationships and other sort of social arrangements. There's an awful lot of kids in our societies, sadly, to this day, who are growing up in homes and being exposed to, quote, domestic violence, right? And we've talked a lot about this. We've had lots of advocacy around this. There's a term that people use to describe those children, and it's children who witness domestic violence. And many people have heard the term. Some people shorthand it to say children who witness. Well, this is a term that I don't like and I don't use. You know why? Because if you're a 7-year-old kid cowering in the closet as your father or another man is, raging against your mother, you're not a witness, you're a victim. You're not observing something happening to somebody else. You're experiencing it happening to yourself. The experience of trauma is much more immediate and profound than is suggested by the passive word witness. Well, guess what? The category of children who are being traumatized in this way includes not just girls, but also boys. Do you have any idea how many boys, for example, are in the juvenile system in Canada and the United States, who are in the system in part because their life journey started out as traumatized boys, and they didn't have the tools, for whatever reason, to take a different path than the traditional path that we give to boys and young men who have experienced these kinds of traumas, which is too often, somebody took something from me, I'm going to take it from somebody else, which is why boys who have been abused are something like 10 times more likely to become abusive of others than boys who haven't. The prisons of Canada and the United States are filled with chronologically adult men who, underneath the kind of, tatted up bodies and the badass, pose and guys, underneath those, that armor, if you will, there's an awful lot of wounded boys, little boys. And by the way, I'm not defending bad behavior by men if what got them into the system was hurting other people. It's not acceptable to take out your pain on other people. I'm not saying that for 1 millisecond, but I am saying that if we really do want to get serious about dramatically reducing the violence that we see men perpetrating, and men perpetrate the vast majority of violence, let's be clear, if we're going to get serious about that, one of the things we do have to talk about is violence done to boys. And a lot of that violence done to boys is done within their family and in their childhood and their early adolescence and their adolescence. And I mean, there's so many men in our societies who are adult men who are walking wounded from the results of, and the after effects of, and the present effects of trauma that they experienced. And that because we live in societies that still, although there's been some progress, that still stigmatize men's seeking help and acknowledging vulnerability, because somehow that's unmanly. Because we still live in a culture where there's so much pressure on boys and men to kind of stuff it, suck it up. We have so much dysfunctional behavior by men as a result, because the body keeps the score and the body doesn't lie. And so what happens is men often either they self-medicate through alcohol or drugs, or maybe even workaholism. They can't, in other words, they can't deal with acknowledging that they need help and that things aren't going well for them. And then they often take it out on others, and then they take it out on themselves. I mean, some of this is so predictable, but the point is that women in the battered women's movement, and men and others, since the 1970s have been talking about the need to focus on children and the effects of trauma on children and how domestic violence harms children, et cetera. And those women are allies to boys, not just to girls. Those women have been pointing us in a direction, all of us in our societies, in a direction that is so much healthier than what we currently have. And yet to this day, there's still resistance to the women in the movement, especially from some men, not all men, I'm not saying that, but that somehow they're bashing men, or that they're unfair to men, or that they've got an agenda against men. And all this is totally problematic on so many levels from my point of view. And I think one of the reasons why it's so important that men like myself and other men across the racial and ethnic spectrum, across the gender and sexual identity spectrum, across the socioeconomic spectrum, I think it's so important that men be part of these conversations. It's so important that men talk about this stuff honestly and openly, both with women, but with other men. I think it's important that we do it publicly as well as privately. And for all those reasons, I'm quite happy that I'm part of your conference today. And so let me move to my next point, which is related to even the name of my presentation this morning, which is, violence against women is a men's issue, essentially. I mean, what does that mean? Well, let me just say, I obviously understand that it's a women's issue, and I've just honored women's leadership, and women in a multiracial, multi-ethnic sense have been and will continue to be at the forefront of all this, and that's all good. But I so believe that men have a much more important role to play, and I think that there's been some movement in that regard. I think that from the time when I was a young man, when I started doing my advocacy and activism, when I was a college student or university student back in the day, long time ago, and it was the early 80s, I was, one of a small number of men speaking out. There's still a small number, but it's grown. It's become more normal and more sort of understood that there are men involved in this work at all different levels. There are institutions that are addressing these issues that are male dominated, that weren't addressing them 20, 30, 40 years ago, like whether it's military, sports culture. We still have enormous uphill challenges in all those institutions, but there is a growing sensibility among men and young men that we have to engage with this issue or this set of issues. But I think the very way that we talk about the subject and the very language that we use itself keeps us in the old paradigm or the old box. And the old box is, these are women's issues, and there are some good men who are helping out those women, and we need more of those good men to help out. And I have a big problem with that frame. I don't think we're going to get very far with thinking about it in such limited terms. It's a women's issue. There are some good men. We need more of those good men to help us out. I'm going to argue that these are men's issues. Now, and again, understanding that they're everybody's issues. But when people say, well, why do you have to use gender terms? Why do you have to say men's issue, women's issue? Why can't you just say these are people's issues? These are human rights issues. These are community issues. These are public health issues, all of which is true. But if you use that kind of gender neutral language and just say everybody's issue, it's everybody's issue. That's like saying with the Black Lives Matter movement, responding to Black Lives Matter slogan or movement by saying all lives matter. The whole point of the Black Lives Matter movement was to call attention to the particular vulnerabilities that African-American people or Black people globally have, especially in relation to state violence and police, potential police violence. The whole point of it was to say that Black people have the right and dignity to be treated with full and 100% human rights and respect, because that's a corrective against the fact that it wasn't happening or it isn't happening. So it's when people say all lives matter, they just completely erase that. Of course, all lives matter, but you erase the fact that it's a particular group that's most profoundly affected by this particular thing when you say all lives matter. Well, it's similar to saying abuse has no gender. Like somehow everybody can be abusive, everybody can experience abuse, and it's not really a gender thing. When in fact, it is a gender thing. And by saying abuse has no gender and that there's nothing really about gender that we should be talking about, what that does is it takes the accountability off of men who are committing the vast majority of the abuse, and not just individual men, but systems that are dominated by men. Political, economic, social systems, cultural institutions that where men have wildly still disproportionate power and influence. And I think it's the opposite direction. In other words, I think saying it, that this is everybody has issues and it's not really about gender is literally the opposite of what we need to be doing. Now, saying it's a men's issue, by the way, is not in any way anti-male. It's not, I don't think there's anything that I've said or that I do in my work is anti-male in any way. In fact, I think it's in men's best interests. I believe this from the moment I started speaking out as a 19-year-old. I think this is in men's best interest. It's obviously in women's best interest as well. But what do I mean by men's best interest? I mean, men are the primary victims, by the way, of most forms of violence, not sexual violence and domestic violence. Women are the primary victims of those. But when it comes to all these other major categories of violence, men are the primary victims as well as the primary perpetrators. When it comes to murder, attempted murder, assault, aggravated assault, gay bashing, bullying, men are the primary victims as well as the primary perpetrators. The same system that produces men who abuse women produces men who abuse other men. The same system that produces men who abuse other men produces men who abuse themselves. I mean, suicide. I mean, in the United States, you probably know, I'm sure you know, we have this gigantic gun violence problem. It's pathetic. And I know that people around the world, including in Canada, think that we're barbarians in the United States, the level of violence that we commit against each other and that we tolerate in our society. And it's shameful. And it is. We had something like 35,000 murders last year. Now, or I'm sorry, 35,000 gun violence deaths. I misspoke. What most people don't know about the gun violence problem in the United States is that 2/3 of gun violence deaths are suicides. And the vast majority of people who kill themselves with guns are men. And the fastest growing category of men who kill themselves with a gun are white men over the age of 50. And so I often say, the same system that produces a 16-year-old guy who pushes his girlfriend up against the locker because she disrespected him in front of his boys is the same system that produces a 20-year-old university student who sexually assaults his fellow student after a night of partying, is the same system that produces a 27-year-old guy who beats up his pregnant wife because he's so filled with anxiety that she is going to be focusing and is focusing on the growing life within her rather than on his needs first and foremost, is the same system that produces a 35-year-old, corporate executive in Ottawa or in Montreal or in Toronto who sexually harasses his either colleagues or subordinates, is the same system that produces a 66-year-old man in the woods of Alberta who goes out and shoots himself in the head as a response to disappointment, grief, loss, feelings of failure, and other issues in his life that he can't deal with. the same system produces all of those outcomes. And that system has to do with gender, and it has to do with how boys and men are socialized into certain kinds of normative attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors around quote unquote manhood. And we're kidding ourselves if we think we can solve these problems of whether it's domestic or sexual violence or harassment or even suicide without talking about gender and without talking about masculinity and masculinities and the ways in which boys and men's lives are narrowly and psyches are so narrowly shaped around constricting definitions and an inability to express emotions beyond anger. I mean, there's so many different pieces to it. But if we don't have the conversation itself, we're just scratching the surface. If we're not willing to go there, in other words, we meaning all of us, but certainly men are not willing to go there and talk honestly about any of this, I think we're just being superficial in the way that we're addressing these enormous problems. Now, language is so critical. The way that we use language to think, to write, to speak is such an important piece of this kind of introspection that I'm suggesting needs to happen. In other words, the self-awareness. So I want to give you a handful of examples of how current ways of thinking are shaped by our use of language. And as an educator, I strongly believe that if you can help people think about how they think, it'll have exponential effects. In other words, it'll bleed over into all these other areas of insight about the world around us, because language structures thought. So here's a handful of examples of the current language that people often use to talk about gender violence that keeps us in the old paradigm. So, okay, so one key one is people often use passive language when they speak about domestic and sexual violence. So they'll say things like, or they'll ask questions like, how many women were raped on university campuses last year in Canada, rather than how many men raped women on university campuses. They'll say things like, how many girls were sexually harassed in this or that school district last year, rather than how many boys sexually harassed girls, or how many girls sexually harassed girls. Or they'll say things like, how many teenage girls in the province of Ontario got pregnant last year, rather than how many men and boys impregnated teenage girls in the province of Ontario last year. In each case, the use of passive language has a very powerful political effect. And the political effect is the shift in focus off of the group with more power and onto the group with less. This is not sloppy thinking. It's not a coincidence. This is how power works and functions, through either stealth or invisibility, or the shifting of accountability off of itself. So I hope you're following me. So in other words, using passive language has a very powerful effect. It shifts our thinking about what's going on. We start thinking about who it's happening to rather than who's doing it. And if we're gonna, if our goal is to provide services to victims and survivors, which is an important goal, then that's one thing. If our goal is to prevent the violence from happening in the first place and to change the systems, including the belief systems that underlie the abuse in the first place, then we have to think about using accountable language. And we often don't. And I'll give you another example of passive language. The term violence against women. I don't use the term violence against women unless I'm critiquing it. What's missing from the term violence against women? Well, it's a passive phrase. There's no active agent in the sentence. Nobody's doing it to women. I mean, women are experiencing it, violence against them, but nobody's doing it to them. It just happens to them. It's kind of like the weather, the weather, it just happens, the weather. But if you insert the active agent, in this case, men, you have a new phrase, men's violence against women. It doesn't roll off the tongue as easily, but it's more accurate, isn't it? It's more honest. And, I mean, this is what, and I also know that some women, even who know what I'm saying, don't use these kinds of terms, like these active language terms, or say things like men's violence against women. They don't, because they know, this includes women in the field, that some men get really defensive in the face of that level of accountable language. So some men push back, they get angry. What are you saying, men? Oh, men are violent just because, some of us are, you're blaming me. It's not fair to, blame me and blame other men. And I resent this. And a lot of women realize, you know what, it's not worth it. I don't need to go down that road. I have too many other things to do. I have to serve the needs of the victims and survivors if I work in the field, or I don't want to get into arguments with my boyfriend all the time or my husband, or, what's the point? Like, let's just move on to other things. And I appreciate that. And I'm not going to say as a man to women, you need to use, active language, but because that's not fair. But I would say that men like myself, including white men who have, and white men with other privileges like socioeconomic status of the various sorts, we're taking a much less of a risk to say these things. And I think it's important that we do that. I think it's important that we hear men saying these things. So that it takes the pressure off of women. They're the ones that should always have to say it. There's the ones who always have to speak out. By the way, it's very similar to racism. It's not fair that people of color should be the ones who always have to bring up race, or always have to bring up racial injustice, or always have to point out when something is going, with some behavior, whether it's individual or institutional, is harming people of color. White people need to say that. White people need to initiate those conversations as well. And it's not fair to put the burden on the people who are most harmed by these abuses, to be also the ones who are most responsible for addressing them. It's just not fair. And it's just not fair when it comes to sexism either. And I think that's one of the roles that men can play in this work, is that we can say out loud some of these things that women often don't want to say, because they know that there could be a really negative pushback against them. And I think if we had more men willing to say some of these basic things that I've been saying, we would see a change happen. And the change that would happen is we'd start having more honest conversations, and we'd have it included men. And I don't think that's anti-male. As I said earlier, I think it's the opposite. I think that so many men are suffering. I think so many men live diminished lives. And by the way, I think that so many men have women and girls in our lives that we care about who have been badly harmed by men and by men's violence. And if we care about those women, and we care about preventing it from happening to other women that we care about, as well as the women who have already experienced these things, then we have a responsibility to do this. And now, when I say responsibility, this is another key point about engaging men. Some men hear some of the things that I've been saying, and some other things, as an attack. And I know this so well that it's so predictable. I could write the scripts in so many cases of some of the pushback that some men will engage in about this kind of dialogue. And by the way, one of the funny things, to me at least, is when guys will say something that's just so scripted and so predictable that people like me have been hearing for 40 years, and they'll think that they come up with something original. It's like so predictable, like saying, not all men, or, you're blaming me for the behavior of others, or that this is just another way of bashing men. I mean, this is so tiresome from my point of view, because it's so predictable, and I don't think it's true. I argued earlier that I don't think it's true, but what you also have been hearing in our societies, especially in the United States, but also in Canada, over the last number of years, is this notion that talking honestly about, for example, our country's pasts, like earlier, the land acknowledgements, which is a way of saying there was genocide here. There was attempted and completed, in many cases, genocide of the native peoples when the Europeans came over centuries ago. And there's an acknowledgement of that. Or in the United States, the fraught discussions about the teaching of history and how much is race and racism going to be present in the teaching of history. And there's this narrative that has emerged over the last number of years that somehow all of this is about trying to make white people feel guilty about being white somehow. Or when it comes to the gender stuff, like domestic and sexual violence, that it's all about trying to make men feel guilty for being men. Decades ago, I and others came up with a way to address this particular problem, or this particular mischaracterization, and it's the difference between guilt and responsibility. So let me just give you an example, or at least a way of thinking about what I'm saying concretely. I don't feel guilty for being a man. Let me just say that right up front. That's silly, okay? I was born a male, and I grew up a man. I was a boy at one point. I'm now a man, but I don't feel guilty about that. It's just who I am. I don't feel guilty that I'm white. I feel like I was just born, and it wasn't a choice that I made. It was just something that, you know, the universe delivered, okay? I happen to be heterosexual. I don't feel guilty that I am heterosexual. It's just who I am. But I do, on the other hand, feel responsible for all of that. I feel responsible, for example, as a white person who believes in racial justice, for speaking out and doing whatever I can with whatever resources I have to work towards fairness, justice, nonviolence, and other inclusive ways of being in a diverse society, or I'm a hypocrite. If I say I believe in those things and I don't do anything about it, then I'm either a hypocrite or I'm, sort of morally, cowardly or something. And I don't want to be that. But it's not about feeling guilty for being white. It's feeling responsible for being white. Similarly with being heterosexual, I don't feel guilty that I'm heterosexual, but I feel responsible for working for justice for people across a spectrum of sexual orientations, especially people who are targeted in a really negative way, including with violence, for being not heterosexual or heteronormative. I feel responsible. And as a man, I don't feel guilty, but I also feel responsible for speaking out about sexism and misogyny in a society and a world in which there's an incredible level of brutality on a daily basis being visited upon women and girls and others mostly by men and young men and boys. I feel, yes, responsible for that. And there's a huge difference between guilt and responsibility. And by the way, guilt is not a motivating emotion. Guilt doesn't make people go out in the streets and become active. Responsibility might, but guilt surely doesn't. And so, I mean, it would be counterproductive, even if it was true that it was about guilt. It would be counterproductive to talk about it and to generate it. But the responsibility piece, very different. I think it is motivating, to say the least. And by the way, if anybody was listening to my discussion about the passive voice, I just want to give you one final example of how passive voice keeps us in the old way of thinking around accountability. It has to do with violence against LGBTQ individuals. You'll hear that often spoken, and it's important to say it, violence against LGBTQ individuals. But that's another way of talking in the passive voice. So you'll hear people say things like, what about all the violence against transgender women or transgender women of color? Aren't they really important, to focus on as the victims of the transphobia and such like that? Well, again, that's all passive language. Violence against transgender women of color. Who's doing the violence? It's men of color and white men, but it's men who are doing that violence. If we want to reduce the violence, in other words, if we want to go to the root of the problem, not just after the fact, take care of the victims and survivors. If we want to go to the root of the problem, we have to say, well, it's men doing it. Why are they doing it? What is the way in which they are self-authorized to police against challenges to this sort of gender order where these people are being identified as transgressing against the norm and therefore need to be punished in some way? What does that say about the group that's in charge, the dominant group, the group in the center? Because violence against people on the margins is usually done by people in the center. And people in the center is another way of saying men, because men are often in the center of power, whether it's in the sports culture, in the military culture, in corporate world, in a blue collar, the factory floor, et cetera. If we don't go into the power structure where individuals reside and that has so much disproportionate influence, and it's often dominated by men, not always. If we don't go into those power centers and try to change the attitudes and beliefs and behaviors, then we're just cleaning up after the fact. And what this means by going into the power center means being honest about some of this topic that I've been discussing. That means thinking about manhood, thinking about what it means to be a man and how we're socializing boys into those narrow boxes. Now, and by the way, I appreciate you listening to me. This is I'm throwing a lot of stuff out there, and in a few moments, I'm going to have some video accompaniment, so it's not just the talking head. And I know it's also early in some parts of Canada and the United States, and I appreciate people this is the beginning of your morning. There's a lot of heavy stuff here, and there's a lot of heavy stuff in the world, and I just want to acknowledge that. But hopefully this conference will give you both conceptual and practical tools to address this stuff in an enhanced way, and raise your sort of consciousness about certain pieces that can be helpful, and you can figure out, as you will, how to apply any of these ideas, whether it's me or others, through the course of the day. So I'm gonna shift gears to, okay, we were talking conceptually about changing language and thinking about this as a men's issue, and I gave you some ways of thinking about that. Now I want to share with you a practical approach to addressing this subject, and it's the bystander approach that I'm one of the architects of. Ellen mentioned it back in the introduction. I'm one of the early architects of bystander thinking around prevention in the sexual assault and relationship abuse prevention field. And I just want to give you some basics, and then I want to show you a clip from my film about this subject to enhance whatever I can say on screen here. But the bystander approach is a way of thinking about preventing domestic and sexual violence and harassment and other forms of abuse, not by focusing on the victim or the target, not by focusing on the perpetrator, but by focusing on everybody else. In other words, all the other members of the peer culture, small or large. What can they do to challenge and interrupt the abusive behavior, to support the victims and survivors, or the potential victims and survivors, but also to a certain extent, how can they help to create a climate within various peer cultures whereby abusive behavior is seen as unacceptable, not because it's illegal and the people who do it will get in trouble with the authorities, whether it's the teacher, the coach, the CEO of the company, the police, but rather the peer culture itself is going to police itself. How can we change practice, whether it's in workplaces, in schools, on teams, whatever it is, where people who are not directly involved in the situation can make it clear to the person doing abusive behavior, what you're doing is not okay, it's not acceptable, it's not just harmful to her or to him or to them, it's also violating the rules of the group or the values of the group, and we're going to not be silent. We're going to support the person who's experiencing it, we're going to challenge and interrupt the person who's engaging in it, but we're not going to be silent. Now, that's the bystander approach in a nutshell. The way that this came about into the field was back in the early 90s, right around the time that Ellen was founding Abuse Hurts. I started a program called the Mentors in Violence Prevention Program at an institute at Northeastern University in Boston called the Center for the Study of Sport in Society. And again, the mini history, there's more to it, but the mini history is, I was trying to figure out where can we find more men. At the time, it was specifically focused on men. Where can we find more men and young men who have the courage, the strength, and the self-confidence to speak out on this subject? Because again, from the time that I was a university student in the early 80s, my feeling was, why aren't there more men speaking out? This is so obviously a men's problem, and men are the ones doing most of the violence. Why is it got to be on the shoulders of women to do everything, including, speaking out? Well, where are the men? So anyways, I thought, okay, sports is such an incredibly important institution. It cuts across all the social categories of race, ethnicity, socioeconomics. It's global, it's urban, it's rural. There was an institute at Northeastern that I was aware of that was already doing this work. There's a proud history in the 20th century and now the 21st century of athletics being the site of social justice struggles around racism or anti-racism, around anti-homophobia and certainly anti-sexism. I was like, okay, how can we leverage the power of the sports culture and get more young men who already have status on campus to speak out and use that status to make it more acceptable for men and young men to have these very kind of conversations. So it wasn't about the problem in athletics of male athletes assaulting women, although there was a problem and there continues to be a problem. It was about the potential positive leadership that athletics could engage in. And so I myself and the director, Richard Lapchick, Dr. Richard Lapchick, who's a pioneer himself of combining sports and civil rights advocacy. Dr. Lapchick and I worked together. We created this grant proposal. We got funded by the United States Department of Education to create a model program. We had this great opportunity. We were going to be working with 9 colleges and universities, including big Division I athletic programs like University of Kentucky, University of Nebraska, but also small liberal arts schools in New England. And the question was, when we work with these men on football, basketball, baseball, soccer, lacrosse, hockey, tennis, what are we going to say to these young men that invites them into the conversation rather than indicts them as potential rapists and abusers? And I say invite rather than indict, which is a phrase from Esther Solar, the founder of Futures Without Violence, an important San Francisco-based organization in the field. I say invite rather than indict because back in the 1970s and the 1980s, the approach to working on this subject matter on college and university campuses was focused mostly on women and what they could do to prevent themselves from being sexually assaulted. And they don't put your drink down at a party because a guy might drop a rape drug in your drink, or look in the back seat of your car before you get in, or have a man's voice on the voicemail, or hold your keys as a potential weapon. All this stuff is still advice that young women are given by their parents and others. And I understand and appreciate it. It's important, but it's not prevention. It's risk reduction under the name of prevention. And back in the day, a lot of what was called sexual assault prevention education was really risk reduction for women. When men were focused on, it was almost always as perpetrators or potential perps. So the spirit of the educational message to men was, you better listen up. You better know when your anger, cycle is, you're rising and you're starting to get agitated, and you need to figure out how to de-escalate. For example, if you're in a relational conflict of some kind, you need to figure out how to de-escalate before you reach the violence floor and you cross the line into committing some kind of domestic violence or sexual assault. You need to know, what the consent laws are in the province of Ontario or in other provinces, because, if you're in a sexual situation, you need to know what the law is so you can back away if you're not fully sure that the person you're with is consenting. The problem with focusing on men and young men as perpetrators or potential perpetrators is that most men don't see themselves in that way, and they disidentify and they tune you out. In fact, most men who commit sexual assault on university campuses in North America don't think that they've done anything wrong. They don't think that they're criminals. They don't think that they've committed sexual assault. They might think that they're sexually aggressive, but they don't think that they're sexual assaulters or rapists. And I mean, imagine what the typical guy, the average guy who's never done anything like that, he's just completely thinking, this is not really about me anyways. Why should I even be paying attention? The problem is deep. If you go into a room full of men and just assume that they're perps or potential perps, the problem as an educator or as somebody who wants to be constructive is that you're going to get a lot of people who have tuned you out, and some people who are even openly hostile. But so I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do we address that? This is back in the early 90s. And the way to address it was a way that people in the anti-bullying field, especially when it comes to middle school bullying, they had already figured it out. Like, let's not focus on the kid doing the bullying or the kid experiencing it. Let's focus on everybody else. And so when it comes to the sexual assault and domestic violence field, the goal of the bystander approach is, for example, in male peer culture, is to get guys who are not abusive to say to other guys, dude, you can't do that. That's not cool. Or the way you're talking to your girlfriend, or I've seen you sometimes with your girlfriend and I'm just really uncomfortable, man. And you're my friend. I just wanted to say that. That's the bystander approach. It's giving men and young men support for, and then concrete specific suggestions for what they can do to interrupt sexism, and not just at the point of attack. This is a critical piece. It's not just need them to jump in when they see an assault happening and stop it from happening. That's closer to what I would refer to as a glorified nightclub bouncer training, like train nightclub bouncers to jump in, stop an assault in progress. I mean, I think it's important for people to figure out what to do if something's actually happening in front of them, like an actual assault. But I think it's way bigger than just intervening when it comes to an incident. It's how do you conduct yourself 24/7 in a way that makes it clear to others around you that you're not cool with that, and by the certain kinds of behavior. And just one analogy, it's like with racism. If you're a white person and you're hanging out with a group of white people, no people of color are present, but one or two of those white people start making really racist comments or telling racist jokes, making degrading comments about people of color. If you as a white person in that room don't make it clear that that's not okay with you, then in a sense, isn't your silence a form of consent and complicity in their racism? And don't we know that racism is not just an individual act, like that disturbed young man who murdered 10 African-American people in Buffalo this past weekend? It's not just an individual act. It's like this whole lone wolf mythology. It's like there are systems that are producing these individuals, and that there are support groups and sort of enablers and beliefs that are fostered in all these different levels in our societies that then result in individuals acting out in these ways. But those individuals are not just individuals. They are representatives of systems in a certain sense. They might be extreme representatives, but they're certainly representative. This is also true of sexism. And the men who assault women, the men who sexually assault women, or who are domestic violence perpetrators, don't just come out of nowhere. Their belief systems are producing them. The socialization of boys are producing them. Normative behaviors. Some cases, yes, they had family experiences and they interpreted those in ways that were harmful, or they reproduced those patterns that were harmful. But there's a lot of deeper sort of cultural roots of the behavior than just to say that there's some individual pathology or some individual sick person. And so when you're a white guy or a white person in a group of white people, and one or two of those white people are acting out in racist ways, making it clear that you're not cool with that is an important part of the change and the work against racism. Just as it's true if you're a man and you're in a group of men and men are talking about women or in some ways normalizing certain kinds of misogynist beliefs, if you don't make it clear that you're not cool with that, then as a man, your silence is a form of consent and complicity in the perpetuation of sexism and misogyny. And then you can't claim that somehow when men assault women and sexually harass women, that somehow you have nothing to do with any of this because you're a good guy and you don't rape women or you don't beat your wife. That's just so simple-minded. So the bystander approach is a way to make this concrete and to have interactive dialogues. The model that I promote, the MVP model, it's not a lecture, it's an interactive dialogue. And so people hear from each other and young men, for example, hear other young men say, yeah, I'm not sure what to do when I see that situation with my friend Jimmy, but you know what? I don't know, and I think I'm the only one who really cares about it. And meanwhile, a guy on the other side of the room is thinking, I don't know what to do either. And I have a problem with that too. They hear that there's other guys who have other of their friends and their peers who are similarly kind of confused or unsure. And then there's strength in numbers. When you think about it like that, there's strength in numbers. When guys realize that other guys feel similarly, they're more likely to act the next time they see something because they realize they're not the only one who's got a problem. And when men feel isolated, when they feel that they're the only one that cares, they're much less likely to say anything because they know that the costs of saying something can be pretty high in their peer culture, because they could be seen as taking, the side of women or something, or not being loyal to the group or not being one of the guys or being soft or whatever it is. Anyhow, let me just last piece before I roll the clip. I've been talking about men as bystanders and men in peer cultures, large and small. But in the second year of the MVP program, back in the early to mid 90s, we went mixed gender, and so it became we dealt with women as bystanders too, as friends, as teammates, as classmates, as coworkers and colleagues. What can women do who are not directly involved in a situation to support to challenge, to speak out, etc. And then beyond the binary, all people who are men, women, non-binary individuals. What can everybody do in given peer cultures to speak up and do the things that I'm saying, rather than keep it confined to the two people directly involved? And the beauty of this is that everybody has a role to play. Everybody has a role to play. And when it specifically comes to men, it gives us a very convincing, I think, argument about what they need to do. Because if men say, which they often do in response to discussions about domestic and sexual violence, not all men do this. It's like, okay, you don't rape or abuse women, fine. But that's not enough. What are you doing to make it clear to the men around you and the young men around you? And if you're an older man, or if you're a father, you're an uncle, you're a teacher, you're a coach, you're a business leader, you're a labor union leader, you're a religious leader, what are you doing proactively, not just when there's an incident, what are you doing proactively to make it clear to the men and young men around you, or the young men or older men who look up to you, or who you have some supervisory authority over, where you say, for example, you're a coach? What are you doing to use that platform of influence to make it clear to the men and young men that abusive behavior, and in this case, men harming women in any way, verbally, emotionally, physically, sexually, is just completely unacceptable and against the values of the group and against your expectations of them as good human beings? What are you doing? And if you're not doing something, let's talk about what you can do starting today. And I think if you frame it that way, positively and aspirationally, and talk to men that they need to be, proactive, I think a lot of men can respond. Now, I want to share with you a clip from my film that I made with my colleagues at the Media Education Foundation a few years ago, called The Bystander Moment. It gives you a little bit of a perspective on the issues that we deal with, and it brings in more than just me as a talking head. So I'm going to ask Kim, if you would, Kim, roll the Bystander Moment clip, please.
Important things that's happened with the Me Too movement is it's not just shine a spotlight on different approaches to how you work with the bystander.
Hi, Jackson. I'm having trouble sharing it. I'm going to try one more time. Sorry. Just give me a minute.
Sure. Can people hear me?
I apologize, everyone. Just if Marcus can come and help, that would be great. Now, every time I go to show the video, it pauses my share. I'm sorry, Jackson. Every time I go to share it, it pauses the share screen. So we're trying to share a video on Zoom. It's not.
Okay, we'll just give it a few more moments and then we'll give up and move on.
Every time I share, it stops my share screen.
You can see, right?
We can see you. So look, share screen. It's in this folder.
Put the folder on your desktop.
It is.
No, put the file on your desktop.
It is. Okay, Jackson, I think we should go without the video. It's not working. I apologize.
It's okay. It's okay. Are we back? Am I? So sorry about
You're
that,
back.
folks. If anybody's interested in the film, The Bystander Moment, it's called The Bystander Moment: Transforming Rape Culture at Its Roots. And it's thebystandermoment.com is the website. You can go to that website for information about the film. You can watch the trailer for the film, get some more information about it. I think it's a good, I hope you think it's a good educational resource that brings in media and porn culture and all the different influences on what we consider norms in our society, and how this bystander approach can help by creating some space to talk about the responsibility of everybody. It can be a constructive way to really address the issues in a preventive sense. Now, I'm just going to say a couple more things, and then I'll open up the floor, because I hope that some people have questions or concerns about things that I've said or not said. I guess the last point I want to make is I understand gender violence prevention as a leadership issue for everybody, but specifically for men. And one of the ways that connects to the bystander approach is that the bystander who speaks up, in other words, the friend who turns to his friend. For example, if a young guy has a friend who's texting his girlfriend constantly, right? He has to know where she is, what she's wearing, who she's with. And the guy who's the friend thinks to himself, this is not really healthy. I mean, he might not have the language to talk about it and think about it, but he's like, this is not really cool. We're not really healthy. I mean, it's not just like he's in love with her. He's like really kind of jealous and trying to control her. And, if he decides in the face of that, it's like, say, a 16-year-old boy, that he's going to say something to his friend. He's going to say, dude, you're my friend, but the way that they're texting your girlfriend, it's just like, I'm concerned about you. That is a leadership act, what he's just done. He has really acted as a leader. He might not see himself as a leader in any way. He might not have credentials next to his name that suggested he's a leader, but that act of speaking up is a leadership act, because what has he done? He's seen a situation of possible harm. Maybe he can't articulate it in these terms. He's seen a situation of potential harm. He's thought about his responsibilities to the various parties, to her, to him, to himself, to his values, again, consciously or unconsciously. And then he's thought about what he could do. What could I do in this situation? And he's selected something, which is to say something, and then he's done it. So in a sense, he's executed a leadership protocol. He's seen an issue or a problem. He's, thought about his options, thought about his, responsibilities, and then acted. That's leadership. Anyways, by framing prevention as a leadership issue, especially in this case for men, because that's my focus of my talk, it's another way of framing it aspirationally and positively. It's saying to men, we need more men and young men who have the courage and the strength and the leadership skills or aspirations to really start making a difference on this subject. But it's also saying to men who are in positions of leadership, you have an extra responsibility, because if you're a leader, by definition, you need to be speaking up. You need to be doing something. We can't in the 21st century have young people, especially in this case, men, who are either in positions of leadership or aspiring to that, and not have in their toolkit of leadership how to speak out about sexism and gender injustice and men's violence against women, as well as racism and intersections, transphobia and anti-LGBTQ harassment, abuse, and violence. All of it's marbled in. But if we set this out as an expectation of leaders rather than a hope that people are going to help out, as I said at the beginning, that men are going to help out, we say we expect our leaders to do this, then we've changed the conversation and we've opened up the doors to a whole bunch of people, including a whole bunch of men who wouldn't voluntarily come to a conference like this or go to a training or sign up for a class on college or university campuses with this subject matter. But they do want to be leaders. They want to be leaders in the workplace. They want to be leaders in the community. And if we say that we expect people who are in those positions of leadership to have these skills, not to be experts necessarily, but to have the certain skills of doing the things that I've been talking about throughout the course of this talk, then we've opened up the doors for a whole lot more people, especially men, to engage with this subject matter. So I think whenever possible, we need to identify this as a leadership issue, institutionally, politically, culturally, and we've got a long way to go. Let me just say, we've got a long way to go, but the positive spin on this is that the upside potential is enormous. Because imagine if we built into the normative leadership training at all levels. Like I think, for example, if you're going to be a president or vice president or social chair of a fraternity or sorority on a university campus, you should be trained in gender violence prevention, leadership. If you're going to be a captain or a co-captain of athletic teams in youth sports, in high school sports, in professional athletics, in university athletics, if you're going to be a captain or a co-captain, you should be trained on how to be a leader proactively on this subject matter. And if you're a person who is uncomfortable with that, then maybe you're not ready to be a captain. Maybe you're not ready to be a president of the fraternity. Maybe if you're in the workplace, if you want to be a manager, if you want to be a director, if you want to be an executive director, this is part of the training that you have to have, or you're not ready to be a leader in the workplace. If you want to be a coach of young people at different levels, you should have coursework on this in university and in graduate school, or if you're not in that track, there has to be leagues and organizations, sports organizations need to create opportunities where there is training. I don't mean extensive training, but training for people who are in positions of leadership. If you're a religious leader and you're in a position of moral and ethical leadership in the community, this should be part of your normative training, period, end of sentence. If you don't have it, you're not being a good leader. I think if we get to that place where this is an expectation, then we're going to see a change is going to happen much more quickly. So I'm going to stop now because I think I have said a lot, and I appreciate people have hung with me the whole time. Not easy listening to me going on here, but we have a few minutes for Q&A. So are we good, Kim? So we're
good.
If people in the chat have questions, if Kim and her colleagues have questions, throw them out, and I'll do my best to counteract one of my weaknesses, which is I don't typically give short answers to complex questions, but I'll do my best to give short answers so more people can ask.
It was a fabulous session, Jackson, and we put the video link right in the both in the portal where you're attending the conference, so you can go back and access it after, and it's also in this chat. So if you have a question, just put it in the chat. Some of the things that I loved about your presentation, Jackson, is the talk about language. I'm very aware of the language that we use and how that can impact people. And I think it's a very powerful message. And there were lots of people commenting about what you were saying around language. So I know that you have created those resources. If there's one thing that you think we should do to take away from today and this message to help with the prevention, what would that one thing be?
Thank you. It would be to figure out how to say to men in positions of influence that that you expect them to get up to speed on speaking out on this subject matter, that it's in 2022, it's just not enough to say you're a nice guy who doesn't harm women. You have to do more. And if you're in a position of leadership, as I just said, this should be like a baseline expectation rather than a hope. And by the way, one concrete suggestion, I know it's self, interested in one sense, but my TEDx talk, just watch my TEDx talk. Like, in other words, if you have a man that who, and it doesn't have to be a formal leader, it doesn't have to be some, powerful individual like in the public space, but if, he's a father, a coach, a teacher, a mentor, an uncle, somebody, show him my TEDx talk. And my TEDx talk, the title is Violence Against Women. It's a men's issue. And then, have a conversation. You don't have to, in other words, if you're a woman, you don't have to do it all yourself. I mean, obviously, there's men like myself who are out there, who are writing, who are making videos, who are, doing TED Talks. There are resources out there. I mean, one of the things that I say, Kim, to a lot of people who say to me, especially men, but also women asking about men, what can men do? It's like, you don't start from scratch. Some of us have been doing this for 50 years. Like, you don't start from scratch. Do some research, go online, find videos, find articles, read op-eds. My websites are, one resource. I'm not the only person, but it's like, you don't have to start from scratch. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, but you have to then download some of the information from some of us who have been doing this work, who have some insights about this stuff, and then figure out how you can connect to some of that, because maybe my work is interesting, but it's not exactly what you're interested in, or it's not exactly the direction you would take it. So, okay, take it in your own direction, but don't just be sitting there passively saying, I'm really not sure what to do. And, and then ended up doing nothing, when there's tons of things that some of us have been doing, but we need more help. We need more people. By the way, the organization Next Gen Men? Mm-hmm. I think it's based in BC, but Next Gen Men is an organization, a Canadian-based organization that does good work. Younger men, Next Gen Men, that would be an organization to look into. Like, what are they doing? Okay. And if you want to get involved with them, go on their website, ask them what they're doing, and see how you can, somehow take advantage of the resources or join them.
Great. That's great, Jackson. We do have another question. What if men don't feel any incentive to get involved? How can we communicate how it impacts them if they don't want to get involved?
The brief answer is, as I said at the beginning, it does impact them. So they don't understand how it impacts them, but it does impact them. And again, if you want to take an intersectional and a complexifying way of thinking about this, men's violence against other men, most men that I know are worried about violence from other men or have experienced violence from other men, et cetera. It's all connected and interconnected. And if they themselves aren't necessarily buying the idea that it's them personally, especially if they have younger men and boys that they have influence on, I think a lot of adult men, let me just say, I'll quickly answer this. A lot of adult men, we have research that shows, not my research, but there's research that shows pretty conclusively that adult men are much more likely to respond positively to their responsibility to young men and boys on this subject matter. They're much more likely to want to do something to help young men and boys navigate some of these issues than they are to challenge their own peers. Now, it's understandable because I think a lot of men, including adult men, are very nervous about and anxious about what their adult male peers are going to think of them. But those men can still be mobilized in their responsibility to children and to young people. And I think we can say to fathers and uncles and coaches and other men who have influenced the lives of young people, okay, even if you yourself are a little bit anxious about this, you have a responsibility to these young men and these boys who are growing up in a culture with all these complex sort of dynamics, the rise of women, the increasing racial and ethnic integration of our societies, and in a culture where the porn culture and the sort of violent media culture is so present, and the rise of a really, crazy political extremism, you have a responsibility to help these young men navigate some of this stuff better than maybe our generation has done. I think men can respond to that because it is, let's face it, it's their responsibility. It's adults' responsibility to raise healthy children. And, you know, there's a great quote, by the way, there's a great quote from the great American abolitionist leader, Frederick Douglass, who was born enslaved, African-American, born enslaved and became an advisor to President Lincoln. And by the way, Frederick Douglass himself was a prominent 19th century supporter of women's rights. This man was way ahead of his time in many regards. A famous quote from him is, he said, "It's much easier to build healthy children than to repair broken men." It's much easier to build healthy children than to repair broken men. So any adult man or woman or others who are in influence with young men and boys need to take seriously, how do we help them navigate these spaces? How do we help women and girls, but how do we help men and boys as well?
That's a fantastic quote to end your session at. So thank you, Dr. Katz, for your fresh and insightful perspective on violence against women. We are now going to take our first break of the day, and attendees can either return to the main lobby to chat with other participants or perhaps visit the exhibit hall. Our panel discussion begins at 10 a.m. We'll see you there. Okay, we're out. Okay, thanks, Dr. Katz. That was amazing. Thank you.
You're very
Okay.
welcome. Good luck with the rest of your day. I hope it goes really well.
Okay, and we'll
you.
make sure they get that video.
Thank you.
Okay, all right.
Thanks.
Bye.
All right,
Bye.
take care.